All right. Awesome. So I am just going to ask both of you as we get started today to tell me a little bit about your background, where you're working now, and what brought you to this industry in particular. So, Ronald, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So I am currently a graduate student at the University of Southern California. I did my undergrad at the University of Virginia, and I interned at Timber Lab, where it was my first exposure to mass timber, and I really enjoyed it. And that's kind of been ever since just a continuation of looking more into timber products along those lines.
So, thank you. How about you, Riley?
Yeah, so I am currently a portfolio manager at Adaptive Commons. So we're an impact investment fund focused on primarily real estate development in the housing space, looking at workforce housing and affordable housing, um, kind of in the middle income range as well. And I just started this job, so before this role, I was at UC Berkeley doing a master of real estate development and design. And that was a 1 year program that really allowed me to kind of like focus on whatever I was interested in. And I focused on sustainability, specifically looking at construction practices, processes, and also building materials. Prior to that master's program, I had worked in architecture for several years. And I hadn't gotten to work with any mass timber projects. Instead, I had kind of become somewhat frustrated with the waste and carbon consumption of the building industry in general. And so, in my master's program, and since I've really been focused on sustainability within the built environment and how to make our cities more livable and sustainable.
Gotcha. Very cool. So this kind of ties right into my next question, which is what experience have you had working with wood or other forest products in your industry? And if you want to just talk a little bit more about what experience you both have with that sort of product in particular, that'd be awesome.
I can start off. As I mentioned before, I interned at Timber Lab where I was a timber engineer, so kind of on the structural engineering side, doing the detailed connections and sizing for glulam and CLT beams. Um, it was just the summer of 2024, and I got to work on some of their research, which involved like composite sections of concrete on top of these timber beams to look at just kind of the floor system to measure any kind of vibrational stuff. So we had like a testing beam out in the lab, and then we went out site to like walk around and measure the vibrational frequency. So it was a pretty cool experience, and yeah, it was just it was a great overall experience last summer.
Yeah, as I said before, when I was working in architecture, I was actually I kind of worked for one company that was focused on single family residential homes. And so that was not an application for mass timber, but definitely an application for wood framing in general. And I think one thing that's really exciting about like mass timber is just the way that construction is already familiar with the use of wood products. And though mass timber is a different scale and kind of a different like level of density in terms of like the amount of like the height it can go and also the amount of people it can maybe house within it, um, it does provide like a seamless transition for more construction companies to begin to use mass timber products and not kind of be dealing with something completely unfamiliar, but rather still the connections are somewhat similar, just at a larger scale. I'm sure Ronald knows much more about like the actual like capacities of different like mass timber connections, but it's still my understanding is like it's a lot of like the same like wood construction theory and kind of structural qualities behind it, even if it is like wood framing versus mass timber. And so as I've transitioned in my career to focusing on more dense housing, I think that mass timber like really does present a really exciting yeah, way to build like housing at scale in cities where we need it.
Yeah, awesome. So I was actually wondering about specific innovations in the field that particularly excite you. So if you want to talk more about that or any other innovations that you've seen in either of your line of work, just anything about innovations coming up that feel particularly exciting.
Yeah, I can jump in first on that question. I think one of like the exciting things I see is actually like sourcing of wood materials. So right now with like wildfires increasing in the US, and just also a push for an increase in production of mass timber in the US and in North America in general. I think that there's like there's a lot of exciting innovation going into like how wood can be sourced for this production. So whether that's selective logging, or other sustainable forestry management practices in order to kind of like be as mindful as possible about where the wood is coming from and how to protect our forests while also decreasing our embodied carbon in the urban environment. I think it's really exciting to think about like kind of the financing mechanisms that go into this and looking at like if there is an end buyer for a mass timber product that can be selectively logged, then there's also an incentive um, on the other end to make it as sustainable as possible when states kind of have the right policies in place to require products to be more sustainable. So I think that there's a lot of innovation going into that side of things, like really far up the supply chain. And that excites me most because I feel like the US is like kind of at a point where production is ramping up. And so there's an opportunity to really put in place the most sustainable practices to make it kind of a long-term viable option for us going forward.
I'd have to agree about the supplier thing. A couple, maybe 5 years ago, a lot of it was kind of imported from Europe, and now you see more and more companies, more suppliers or fabricators here that are pushing for American made. At my time during Timber Lab, they just recently announced that they're opening a Oregon facility to, supply more. I think it was CLT. So it's exciting to see a push for U.S. made mass timber products.
Thank you both. And have you had the opportunity to collaborate much with forestry professionals in this space? Or if or you have not, what benefits do you see from potentially having the space to collaborate with forestry in this area?
I personally haven't had the opportunity to collaborate directly with forestry professionals, but I have kind of had the opportunity to collaborate with some scientists that are focused on like carbon sequestration,
Sure.
more so from like an academic, like at UC Berkeley background. And those, like specifically two scientists I talked to, one of them was really excited about this idea of thinking about wildfire mitigation in
Mhm.
kind of in conjunction with mass timber production and how to really like make that part and like process of the supply chain. I think like forests are such an important um, reservoir for carbon in our on our earth, and so thinking really strong, like really mindfully about how to protect those reservoirs while also acknowledging that like younger trees are trees that are sequestering more carbon from the atmosphere and could play a role in like more sustainable practices if we were to like study and partner with scientists to make sure that forests are being managed in the best way possible.
So would you say you see kind of a need for more of a connection between the academic side and the more practical boots on the ground work? Is that something that you think could be developed further as we move along?
Yeah, definitely. I would say just in general, I think mass timber, like also from a design perspective, requires like collaboration, like really early on and for an individual building to be designed as mass timber, but even like further up the supply chain from that, like having mass timber suppliers and forestry professionals collaborate and be more involved in like the same process rather than kind of their own little separate section of the supply chain I think is really important because like ultimately carbon can be saved at every step of the process, but only so much carbon can be saved if the processes aren't talking to each other. And so that's something I've like found just in my research of like how production can be ramped up in the US. Like I do think there's a need for much more collaboration, both at a national level, but even more specifically at a like local and regional level. Like having specific suppliers like being super knowledgeable about their backyard and like their forest and their region and how can like we use those forests and those resources in their region to then supply like ultimately a mass timber building within that same region is something that I think will require collaboration along the whole gamut.
Yeah, really tapping into that local knowledge is essential for so many of these projects too. Ronald, I'll just pose the same question to you so you have an opportunity to answer. Have you had any opportunity to collaborate with forestry professionals, or what kind of benefits would you see from that sort of collaboration?
I haven't had any experience, but seeing in the industry, it's cool to see a lot of these kind of companies partner with these suppliers or wood product owners just to kind of do research, develop it, because then you just bounce around these kind of ideas of some expertise in some areas, so you get kind of like a holistic view of what a timber product can provide. So yeah, that's the benefit I'd see.
Yeah, awesome. And what challenges have either of you faced in working with timber or forest products? Are there any barriers that you've found to this kind of development, or what other challenges have arisen for you?
I would say that Ronald kind of touched on this briefly, or at least mentioned it, but like right now, so much of or a lot of mass timber is still coming from Europe and other markets. And so I think like a big thing is beginning to produce mass timber at scale in North America would, in my mind, like really help the entire supply chain and also stem development of mass timber projects across the US and beyond. And I think that like going along with that is just like a really important need for um there to be like more understanding and like focus on mass timber as a viable construction practice and a viable structural material for high density buildings in the US. I think there's such a push right now for increased density of housing and other building types in so many of our cities, and yet like the US mindset is still to kind of revert to steel or revert to concrete, which is super carbon intensive and takes so much longer and has like a lot of drawbacks. But I think there's a lot of the real estate industry and the construction industry are both like industries that are slow to adopt new innovations. And so, like really making production happen in the US, I think would stem that on one hand, but also like having more knowledge and kind of sharing of the values and like benefits of mass timber on the building side and on the development side, I think is necessary as well to make kind of the change happen.
Yeah, and that taps into what you were saying too before about needing more of those connections at every step of the way about, understanding the research and development, implementing that, and then kind of communicating that on a broad scale too. It's very interesting. Thank you.
I guess from what I see is going back to the European manufacturer thing is it'd be nice to see a lot more American made because a lot of times you see on these kind of early on a lot of projects get selected to be mass timber and eventually they get priced out because there's so many uncertainties, like people aren't really familiar with the price tag with mass timber, so they kind of either bump it up higher and then decide to revert back to steel or um, look at other alternatives. So it's cool to see the industry pushing towards mass timber, but it'd just be nice to see it go through the entirety for that project.
Yeah, I think like kind of along those lines, like developers, which is the industry I'm definitely in, like kind of just immediately associate mass timber with being more expensive. And though like there are like the material costs may be more expensive right now, there's so many other savings regard like with regards to times saved and waste saved and lower labor costs. And all of those things are just kind of like require a different mindset from developers and also like an openness to like their balance sheet and their uses and sources and from a finance perspective, like looking a little bit different, but not necessarily overall. Like the project can be cheaper. I have done case studies on projects that have been cheaper. But unfortunately, right now, like the assumption kind of tied to mass timber is that it's more expensive. And sometimes it really is.
And what has most surprised you about working with forest products? Just kind of a broad, open question for either of you.
I guess from the design perspective, I found it a lot less, I guess, complicated than your steel or concrete. It honestly felt like Lego pieces sometimes. You just kind of connecting them together, and the simplicity of it was really nice, but it also provided its challenges that helped you kind of think more um, theoretical, but just the simplistic nature of the initial design is pretty cool to see.
I think this honestly isn't surprising, but it was something that like felt very reassuring is just there's a lot of new research going into like the kind of holistic impact of buildings that are built with wood. And just like there's research showing that people are more productive in wood buildings, like when they're working in an office that's been built out of mass timber. Um, and that there's also like health benefits. And that's something that like at my core I kind of like can see humans have been living in wood structures for like centuries and centuries, but at the same time like to kind of see the research to back that up is something that's really exciting, and it's surprising to kind of like actually see the statistics and be like, wow, like I could be healthier if I were living in a mass timber building, and like how much does that like mean to society? I think like it can have a great impact.
Yeah, it's awesome. And then I just have one more general question for both of you, which is how can the Society of American Foresters and our members support your sector? Are there any areas that you see as strong points for future collaboration or integration or community building or anything along those lines? What kind of support would you like to see?
I think you kind of probed at this earlier, but I would just like go back and agree with you that like any sort of partnering that can happen between your members, between forestry professionals at large and the development industry in general, whether that's like designers, engineers, contractors, like all of the above. I think that often developers are separated from like the supply chain that they so desperately like rely on. And as we move towards an environment that is hopefully more sustainable and a way of like living and building in our urban areas that is more sustainable, I think that there's a huge importance to have collaboration from like the person that's ultimately opening a building for people to live or work in, and the people who are like protecting and helping provide the resources necessary to build that building from the beginning. So, um, yeah, any sort of collaboration or partnerships or like just bringing fields closer together, I think is hugely valuable, and I would be super excited about it.
Yeah, I'd have to agree about collaboration. In terms of kind of like the research that you see, a lot of the times academia partners with the industry. So getting involved in those kind of research projects early on would be very beneficial to providing a, again, the holistic view from supplier to supply chain to design to application.
Yeah, awesome. And is there anything from either of you that you didn't get a chance to bring up yet that you were interested in sharing, or any questions you have for me or for each other?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
No problem. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to do this today. I'm really excited to get to share this with our members, and I'm sure they're going to be super excited to hear what y'all have to say. So thank you again for meeting with me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoons.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
You have a good weekend as well.